From an otherwise unremarkable Christmas vacation in 1990, one out-of-nowhere NES game is the only thing I fondly remember. And even though it didn't exactly capture my imagination at the time, and even though it would be shelved for almost my entire childhood, and even though it would thoroughly destroy me every time I dusted it off, it was always a game I've liked and one I've wanted to finish. It has been over 30 years now, and it's time. It's finally time to put this one to rest. But we're also going to double down with the original Japanese version too. It was my first ever shmup for my first console, and that game is Air Fortress. Air Fortress was developed by HAL Laboratories and originally released to the Famicom in 1987. It would later be localized and published in North America by HAL America in 1989. Though it predates Sunsoft's Metafight in Japan, it was released after Blaster Master in the West. As such, it often seems to draw comparisons to Blaster Master, though the two couldn't be more different. So, what makes Air Fortress tick? Let's take a closer look. Players are in for a daunting fight in Air Fortress, and each of the game's 8 areas is split into 2 phases. The first is the airbase phase, which has players approach the Air Fortress as a side-scrolling shooter. Players move Hal Bailman aboard his lightship using a typical 8-way control scheme. Hal's rate of movement is decent enough, though it is a bit on the slow side in general. On approach, players will often find various items that can be picked up and added to a pair of numeric totals in the top left-hand corner of the screen. The first is Hal's energy, which will start with a base amount dependent on the stage being played, and supplemented 100 points at a time with each E pickup. The higher, the better. Players will also find B pickups, which are added to Hal's beam bullet stock. Players always start with 0 at the beginning of every stage, and these beam bullets are extremely handy for reasons we'll get into shortly. Both the A and B buttons will fire the lightship's light cannon. Many enemy waves will approach Hal at various points in his approach, and each has its own unique design and behavior. Most can be killed off with a single shot, but some are a little more resilient, requiring several hits to finally be blasted away. Especially with larger swarms of faster foes, and against those that fire bullets at the player, a quick trigger thumb is definitely going to be needed. That's because there's no rapid fire in Air Fortress, and while it could be seen as a crutch by some, rapid fire is still definitely the most efficient way to play, especially to avoid joint and muscle strain. Any controller with turbo buttons like these turbo card pads or an NES Max will fit the bill, as would a stick like the NES Advantage. The same goes for add-ons like the NES 4-Score or even software solutions as found in the retro USB ADS. The point is, efficiency is king in Air Fortress, and with that efficiency comes a much higher potential for success. Enemies can also drop various power-ups and enhancements, including energy and beam bullets. However, 2 more items used exclusively in the airbase phase can also be found. The barrier, indicated by this diamond-shaped icon, will allow Hal to crash into enemies and withstand hits from bullets while it is active, allowing players to get through tricky parts of the approach. And the enemy-busting function pickup, which will wipe out all enemies on the screen, no exceptions. Basically, with a full crowded wave of baddies, the function will often result in an item being left behind, sometimes even another function to wipe out the next wave. All of this sounds pretty dandy, but there's a catch. While Air Fortress gives players a decent amount of predetermined energy and beam bullets, anything dropped by enemies is completely random. Players could get barrier after barrier, function after function. Sometimes a ton of extra energy will be left behind, others a bunch of beam bullets, or others nothing at all. This proto-roguelike setup can also make things easier or harder depending on what's dropped and collected. As such, these enemy-spawned extras should only ever be seen as a potential bonus rather than something planned into a run. In the airbase phase, players have 3 lives. If they are hit, a life is lost and players respawn right away. There are no extends in Air Fortress, and if all lives are lost, a password is given and players have the option to continue at the beginning of the airbase at the last Air Fortress reached. The password can also be used to continue the next time players turn the game on. Since there is no scoring system in Air Fortress, this is a fine concession, especially when the next phase is taken into consideration. At the end of the airbase phase, players will be guided to an airlock where Hal disembarks from his lightship to enter the interior of the air fortress. Inside, players are tasked with exploring and destroying the central reactor of a labyrinthian structure that houses a wide variety of robotic countermeasures dead set on reducing Monsieur Bailman to ash. Everything from movement to firing Hal's gun will require energy, which is deducted from Hal's total. So long as Hal isn't hit by an enemy or their bullets, this energy will recharge to its original level both if the player rests in place, or in some cases during freefall. However, if the player sustains damage, their energy is permanently lost as a result. Through constant use, players can reduce their energy to a mere 5. If, of course, it reaches 0, it's game over, and players will need to start again from the airbase phase. Hal's light blaster is once again fired with the A button, but now the B button is used to fire his collected beam bullets. These bullets have a distinct sound and explode on impact with walls and enemies, inflicting great damage as they do so, with the added bonus of a lingering splash damage radius. While most enemies can be taken out with the light blaster, others like small cores or enemy, Bailman, I guess, is never really explained what all of these enemies are called. Hey, if anyone out there has this info, hit me up. Anyway, these harder to destroy foes are what players will want to save their beam bullets for, in addition to the main reactor. Some enemies can only be defeated with a beam bullet, but others can be skipped with a bit of skill. Thankfully, both energy and beam bullets can often be obtained from defeating these enemies through the main body phase. Clean hits that destroy these enemies can lead to what I often call bomb profit, where we get 5 bombs for having only used 1, which is good. The main objective here after infiltrating and raiding each air fortress is to locate the main reactor in the depths of each one, destroying it and getting the hell out of Dodge by jumping into an escape lightship. The first air fortress is pretty simple. The escape ship is right there. The second, not so much. There's still a bit of backtracking needed, but it's easy enough. But by the 5th fortress, progress is going to get much more confusing, complete with dead ends, enemy traps, and warp points that send players to areas that require complicated navigation to get back on track. Players are going to need an intricate, intimate knowledge of the best routes to follow, all the while formulating the most efficient way to deal with some truly insidious enemies, some of which can sap hundreds or even thousands of points of energy in no time at all. Especially these bastards. But that's not all, and this is where things get downright rude. When the main reactor is destroyed, the lights will dim and players will have just a couple of minutes to make it to their escape ship. At first, no worries, let's get going. But after a little while, the air fortress will start to rumble. This will intensify, the tension will build, the lights will begin to pulse, and finally, if the player takes too long... death. Game over. Try again, kid. Again, easy enough in earlier stages, but starting in stage 5, players will often only reach their ship when it's down to the friggin' wire, with mere seconds, or less, left before destruction. Knowing where to go exactly will help, but only just. The 8 stages found in Air Fortress will surely test any who play it, but for those that can conquer them, a second, more difficult loop awaits. Indicated with a flipped color palette, the airbase phase is identical to what players know of each fortress, but inside the belly of the beast, many more enemies are ready to crush the player. And fitting up the difficulty spike in the normal quest, Stage 5 starts adding alternate routes and progress points to the main body phase, meaning players will need to learn all new strategies and unused routes to escape. If players can best all 16 air fortresses, then and only then can they view the credits and sit back with a smug sense of satisfaction or something along those lines. One thing that we've noticed is how well the game runs overall. The controls are solid and very responsive. There's almost zero sprite flicker, and it maintains a solid frame rate with a high sprite population that only very rarely dips when things get truly extreme. Granted, Air Fortress is still a simple game with simple mechanics. It doesn't try to be anything it isn't, and that's not a bad thing. In the end, I still really like this game quite a bit, despite the relative indifference and sporadic disdain most have for the title. And yes, it's still very difficult starting on Stage 5. As a game with only survival as its core objective with a password continue, its staying power may be a little weak, but I still enjoy firing it up periodically to relive the adventures of Hal Bailman to this day. And this definitely won't be the last time. For those that need a little more though, well, it's time to import. If Air Fortress's main game is normal and the second loop is Pro mode, then the Japanese version of this game is definitely Pro Plus, with its second loop being Pro Max. There are several differences between the Japanese and North American versions of Air Fortress, some subtle, others not. But for fans of the NES release looking for a little more punishment, the Famicom version might be for you. First off, players start each stage of the Famicom version with far less energy than on NES. Where subsequent stages give players more and more energy on NES, Famicom starts the player with just 100 for most fortresses. In fact, only Fortresses 7 and 8 have identical energies to start in both versions. Death is also much more significant in the Famicom version as well. The bad news is, if a player dies in the airbase section, they won't simply respawn. Instead, they'll be checkpoint restarted. The worst news is, the checkpoint is all the way back at the beginning of the airbase, stripped of any energy and beam bullets collected. Worse still, this will occur regardless of how far in the airbase phase the player has made it. This comes to a head in the 8th stage, as the final enemy wave is nearly impossible to clear unless players can score a barrier item to barrel through at just the right point. Continuing isn't as simple as the NES version either. If the player gets game over, they better remember that password they just got, because they'll need to enter it in to continue the stage they were just at, regardless of whether or not the system is reset or the power is cycled. Enemies are also quite a bit more spongy than their North American counterparts. These blue robots, for example, take 3 hits rather than just 2, and these tanks take 5 instead of 3. Anything that requires multiple shots to kill generally takes 50% more abuse on the Famicom version than on NES, which, when paired with the reduced energy reserves, makes things quite a bit harder regardless of the stage, phase, or loop. For fans looking for the ultimate Air Fortress challenge, well, this is it. There is also quite a bit more slowdown in crowded areas within this version of the game, something that was ironed almost completely out of the later NES release. Speaking of Super Pro Max mode, the Japanese version requires a series of 3 passwords to unlock the second loop, which is revealed when the first loop is completed. The NES version, on the other hand, simply flows right into loop 2. There are more differences between the two from a presentation standpoint, but this brings us right into our next topic. As an NES shoot-'em-up from the middle of its lifespan, Air Fortress has an unmistakable presentation that, despite many other shooting games before it, has a truly unique set of visuals and sound. First and foremost though, I think we need to have a chat about the lightship. HAL cruises into battle on this scooter-type spacecraft in a more or less prone position that, well, it just can't be comfortable. There's riding your ship, and then there's your ship riding you. Oof. Character sprite aside, the airbase phase prominently features scaffolding and electric couplers littered all over the background, with stage hazards generally represented with gray sprites. A number of asteroids and glowing red heat points can also cause HAL to crash and burn if players aren't careful. Once again, the second loop flips the gray and colored points, making color dangerous and gray harmless. The enemies here are also well enough designed, with each enemy type behaving uniquely from one another, allowing players to quickly adapt in order to maximize their destruction. Inside the fortress, enemies and explosions are generally more detailed, and the backgrounds vary widely, with all kinds of colors and tile sets adding a vast array of personality and texture to each section of the fortress. This will also help in assisting players in navigating the fortress using visual cues, which is very helpful, especially in later stages. Air Fortress's sound is somewhat limited, but no less fitting. There are no sound effects that come off as irritating, which is a great start, and the music is generally catchy, typical of most HAL Laboratory games. A heroic intro, the airbase's invasion-style track, the main body's BGM reminiscent of a robotic assembly line, the haunting, eerie calm of the powered-down fortress, all of these tracks are excellent. However, given that there are only a total of 7 music tracks in the entire game, including the credits, players may find themselves getting tired of the same music playing so frequently, especially in the often long main body phases. The earlier Famicom version has a number of differences with its presentation as well. First and foremost, Air Fortress's text. While also completely in English, it's quite a bit different. While worded very differently, the introduction is largely the same, but it feels very disjointed. Approaching and entering the Air Fortress is much more foreboding though, with players encountering the Air Fortress rather than approaching it, and intruding rather than merely entering. We definitely prefer the more aggressive wording. While the airbase phases are visually identical to their NES counterparts, collecting a barrier will result in a pulse rather than a hard flicker, which we like a little bit more. But then, many of the elements and backgrounds found within the Air Fortress can often be vastly different from what would end up being used in the NES version of the game. These visual changes do a remarkable job of making the exact same game feel very different from one another. The sound isn't quite as refined either, with the general flow of the music being a little less finessed. Some of the notes are noticeably less staccato than their later final renditions in the 1989 release. Multi-hit enemies sound quite a bit different here as well, with a more shrill bullet strike. Others, like these fast movers, have no sound at all. The NES and Famicom versions have different ending sequences too, but I couldn't beat the Japanese version to show you all this because a green title screen for the second loop has also been removed from the NES version, and the ending theme is entirely different, with the NES version holding the edge, which, is definitely for the better. All of this kind of makes Air Fortress on the Famicom feel more like a prototype than a finished final game, which is kind of fascinating to us. But when it all comes together, how does Air Fortress stack up? Let's take a look. While a tad slow, the control in Air Fortress is serviceable. Though the Famicom version is quite a bit harder, even the NES version of the game will challenge players' memorization and navigation skill in later stages, especially once the main reactor is destroyed. With a seriously lengthy campaign in 8 parts, each with 2 long phases which are doubled up with a harder second loop, Air Fortress has a large amount of game to play. Its staying power may suffer with no scoring system though, with its unique personality shining through both in the airbase and main body phases of each fortress. Air Fortress looks pretty good, with near zero sprite flicker and slowdown. At least that is on the NES. While the sound in general, from the effects to the BGM, is actually very high quality, it becomes extremely repetitive, especially in the main body phase. Though the scrolling, shooting, and exploration phases married together was still a very new thing in 1987, Air Fortress's simple gameplay mechanics make it look less involved than it actually is from the outside looking in. Thankfully, it's still a blast to play. Air Fortress can frequently be had for about $10, giving it a great value for its price. Finally beating this one not only on the first but also the second loop was a pretty gratifying experience. This was absolutely a difficult game to overcome, but it was well worth it in the end. I've played Air Fortress for hundreds of hours now, and I'm not done yet. Overcoming the Famicom version is my next objective. If that doesn't count for anything with regards to its fun factor, well, nothing I can say will. Air Fortress gets a 4 out of 5. You can get a copy of Air Fortress rather easily for next to nothing these days, regardless of the version you choose to get. That's another one from my childhood down, and it felt pretty good defeating it. I wonder if, given that I rarely played Air Fortress as a child, my parents wondered if they had wasted their money buying me this one. Who would have known that I would keep going back for 30 years? Alright, so what's coming up next? Well, that's a surprise, because I don't know whether or not we're even going to see Raiden 4 Cross Mikado Remix on the Switch until like June. So, until then, we'll see you all in the next episode with something neat? Quick aside, whatever you do, never press pause when you're in the middle of a transport tube. Whoops.